Long ago in a galaxy far, far away, a couple of rather unremarkable dudes named Aristotle and Plato created mimesis. Now, contrary to how it sounds, mimesis isn't the name of a Pokemon, which is a sad waste in my opinion, but it is a philosophical term used to refer to imitations, especially to things like art and its relation to the world. If you have ever heard the term art imitates life, that is pretty much the condensed thesis statement of mimesis. It is that things happening in the real world will have an effect on artistic expression. And the reason I bring this up is because mimesis plays a critical role in understanding how Bojack Season 5 was written, especially the final 2 episodes. They were the culmination of multiple themes that persisted throughout the entire season, but in my opinion, the most powerful overarching theme was that of perspective, and how it can differ between people and change before our very eyes. Now, I won't get too into the nitty-gritty of point of view in real life, because it should be self-evident, but it can be understood as a particular attitude or way of considering a matter. POV from a written standpoint is the narrator's position in relation to the story being told. And if we want to get extremely specific, POV can also be the literal position from which something or someone is observed, like POV in certain, adult entertainment. And even though I never thought I'd say it, adult entertainment is the perfect segue into talking about one of Season 5's standout characters, Henry Fonda, an honest-to-goodness Frankenstein sex monster of Todd's own creation. Henry Fonda's representation in the show is completely based upon mimesis, how Bojack's team of writers were influenced by the circumstances around them, and also how to produce a conversation of perspective as best they could. Show creator Raphael Bob Waxberg has admitted Henry Fonda wasn't supposed to be a commentary on social or political subjects at first. In his words, it started out as, let's have Todd build a sex robot. That'll be funny. Originally, we were thinking about stunt casting the character with Alicia Vikander, because she played a similar character in Ex Machina. But while creating this character, real-life conflicts around sexual misdeeds and assault started to engulf the lives of people all across America. Wax and his team recognized that after people like Les Moonves and Charlie Rose were ousted from television, the public perspective on sexual misconduct by men had drastically changed, and a character like Henry Fonda would have to change as well to match. Upon consideration of these factors in real life, Wax decided that Henry Fonda should have a man's voice. It should be a male robot. And it wasn't just the voice that adapted to changing circumstances either. Henry Fonda's story arc went through significant alterations too. Originally, the character was going to have a drawn-out series of events that led him to becoming the head of a company, but the writers chose to go a different route and condense that all down to a few scenes. Wax has said, "We can tell a larger story here about how quickly these guys rise through the ranks, now that the way these guys get ahead is suddenly seen in a new light. There's a statement there about how men, or things coded as men, this is a robot, are given the benefit of the doubt." All these changes were predicated on a social reform you have probably heard about, the Me2 Movement, a massive shift in public perspective about how women and men should be treated in regards to sexual advances and conduct. And again, Wax has been upfront in talking about how he feels the Me2 movement has changed his perspective about storytelling. He said, "The kinds of stuff that maybe in the first season would have been treated as a punchline, all of a sudden are not so funny, if even they were funny then. My frame for this behavior has really shifted. It's amazing that we've allowed ourselves as an industry to go so far down that road, to rationalize and legitimize that behavior as just par for the course." Now, I'm a full page into the script and am well aware that this video sounds like it should be titled Henry Fonda, because I haven't said word one about Bojack himself as a character. But I felt it was very important to set up this explanation of perspective and POV with the show's creator's words in mind, especially the last sentence of the quote. To go so far down that road, to rationalize and legitimize that behavior as just par for the course. At the end of the day, mimesis isn't just about understanding how cultures or religions or nature affect art. It's about understanding how anything outside art affects and impacts that art. Knowing that Wax was very concerned with his own shift of perspective after viewing the past will help make clear some of the decisions that were made in the writing of the season. In my view, the season itself is based around perspective and how it changes, and we can look at how the writers use narrative POV as a tool to craft a message on the shifting of real-life perspective. Some methods were overt and easily noticeable, like Henry Fonda, who is probably the most literal representation of changed perspective in the season. We, the audience, know exactly what he is, a poorly constructed conglomerate of dildos, whips, and wires that is in no way qualified to ever run a company. But for the rest of the characters in the show, it takes a dozen episodes for them to dispel their illusions and dismissals about him and perceive Henry as what is so readily apparent to the audience, as what he really is. Another blatant use of malleable perspective is the episode Int Sub, where the characters in the show are plain different. We are quite literally seeing them in a new way because of the perspectives of 2 new characters who must distort their identities for confidentiality reasons. But the two characters that most closely intermingle with the concept of perspective that Wax talked about are Mr. Peanut Butter and Bojack. Each of their story arcs apply a different use of POV to arrive at the same thematic conclusion, though they each represent a different way of handling changed perspective. For Mr. Peanut Butter, the biggest change comes in episode 8, where we get a POV of him over 25 years going to the same party, but each time with different women. At the beginning of the episode, his perspective on his love life is that his wives and girlfriends all start out great, but become more boring, cynical, and non-compatible as the relationship progresses. But at the end of the episode, he realizes, and by extension the audience does too, that the women aren't the problem. He is. Mr. Peanut Butter's relationships fail not because the women change to be meaner or more dull, it is because they mature as people. Their wants and needs become less about external excitement and more about internal discovery. As Diane says, they grow up. But Mr. Peanut Butter refuses to. He craves the instant gratification of spur-of-the-moment, no-strings-attached entertainment, so that he doesn't have to confront anything about himself or life. He even says as much all the way back in season 1. The key to being happy isn't searching for meaning. It's to just keep yourself busy with unimportant nonsense, and eventually you'll be dead. Mr. Peanut Butter doesn't know how to function without a woman in his life that can co-endorse his immature behaviors, because it seems that, to him, life isn't worth living. In the Halloween episode, he finally realizes how far down the road he is, how he has rationalized and legitimized this behavior as par for the course. When considering Bojack, POV techniques are used in a completely different way. Instead of the characters catching up to the perspective of the audience, as with Henry Fonda, or the audience changing their perspective alongside a character, as with Mr. Peanut Butter, Bojack's POV becomes so splintered and skewed that neither he or the audience knows where they stand, or how to view what they are seeing. Bojack's perspective is split between his real life and Filbert, and they slowly bleed together before culminating in a violent dissociative episode. Instead of trying to tell us how fractured Bojack is, the show puts us in his shoes and allows us to be just as confused as he is. We see the world from his perspective. And Bojack's confusion is born of two things: his habit of inextricably tying himself to his roles and his addiction to dysfunction. Just like how Bojack so closely identified with horsing around that it became his identity, the same thing happened with Filbert. The show gave him new life, it gave him new meaning, it made him popular again. Filbert became so entangled in Bojack's mind that he stopped changing out of his costume after shots. He even started dating Gina in real life, Filbert's love interest in the show, and found it to be the best relationship he's ever had. But it was this very success in both career and love that drove Bojack to his lowest point. And this is where Bojack's addiction to dysfunction comes in. At his core, Bojack believes he isn't worthy of such great outcomes because he's a bad person. When he sinks into a complete hallucination, his mind creates an image of Gina, and she says, "You don't want that, for everything to be fine. How dreadfully boring." Bojack's hallucination of Gina then sings about how life is a never-ending show, how nothing is certain but the curtain, and how you can't stop dancing until that curtain falls. And outside his hallucination, Bojack's certainty of his unworthiness becomes cemented when he asks Diane to write a takedown piece about him. He says, "I need this. I'm a bad person, and the world needs to know." And it is immediately after this moment that Bojack's perspective on his past changes, and it's because of what Diane tells him. She says that there are no bad people in the world, just like there are no good people, just people who do bad things sometimes and good things sometimes. And if Bojack wants to be better, he cannot count on other people to hold him accountable. He has to do it himself. Because of this conversation, Bojack realizes he doesn't know how to hold himself accountable. He realizes how far down the road he has gone, and now he has rationalized and legitimized his behavior as just par for the course. He arrives at the same conclusion Mr. Peanut Butter did at the Halloween party. Both of these characters recognize their past and change their perspective on what was acceptable and what was not. The only difference between Bojack and Mr. Peanut Butter at this point, and it is a major one, is that Bojack represents a change of perspective that amounts to action, while Mr. Peanut Butter continues down the same path. In his time of crisis, and in light of his changed perspective, Bojack makes the difficult, mature decision to go to rehab. Conversely, Mr. Peanut Butter chooses to marry Pickles in order to avoid making the difficult, mature decision of acting on his changed perspective. Personally, I feel that showing both outcomes really adds weight and power to the writing, and the message that surrounds it. The creators demonstrated that an alteration in perspective does not equate to change, action does. Like any good argument, and that is really all a narrative philosophy is, it is important to show both sides of an argument, to view both sides from a different perspective, even if someone might side with the perspective you feel is wrong. Showwriter Nick Adams touched on this when he said, "The danger of being sophisticated and nuanced is that you're going to be misinterpreted. How do you account for that? Is it your responsibility as an artist to account for the ways that your show will be misinterpreted? More and more, I think, yes, somewhat. Most of it you can't account for, and it's going to be out of your power. But it's disingenuous to wash your hands from it entirely and say, look, I'm just making a show. Bojack Season 5 was that of wild twists and wild turns, great highs for some characters, and tremendous lows for others. It was a season where themes built up in the initial episodes of the show finally come to a head. But as much as it was the continuation of a show we have all grown to love, it was a novel view into the deepest aspects of its characters and the negative situations they fostered and forced themselves into. We learned more about them than ever before, and in ways where they discovered things alongside us. Season 5 may have been the darkest season of the show to date, but it was also the season that emphasized finding a new perspective on not only the world around us, but on ourselves. If you like what you heard and want to support the channel, check out my book on Amazon. As always, it was a pleasure speaking to you guys, and I will talk to you all next week.